Ernst Bloch, A Marxist Romantic, by Jürgen Habermas. Were I not scared by Ernst Bloch's generous use of mottos, especially those citing the author himself, I might have picked the following. Reason cannot flower without hope. Hope cannot speak without reason. Both in Marxist synthesis, other science has no future. Other future has no science. This is one of the few epigrams of an epic thinker whose forte is not always the small gem, the aphorism, the parable. Bloch allows the abundant stream of his thought to expand into broad narrative. The voluminous compendium Das Prinzip Hoffnung, Hope as a Principle, written in the United States, finished and edited in East Germany, and published in West Germany, Frankfurt, 1959, is a mirror of a philosopher's wanderings and of his inner development, a mind's odyssey in the spirit of Exodus. Like a knight-errant, the thought wanders in quest of the dark source of being, as Jakob Böhme said. Nothingness craves thingness, and hunger is desire expressed in the first verb. Fiat, let there be. Bloch follows the same motif when he stresses hunger over Freudian libido as the fundamental drive. Ever-renewed hunger makes man run, widens self-preservation into self-expansion, and in its most enlightened development transforms itself into a force blowing up the prisons of need. Informed hunger, another form of docta spes, learned hope, unfolds into a resolution to abolish all conditions under which men vegetate as shipwrecked creatures. Hunger appears as the elemental energy of hope. The work itself which Bloch devotes to hope betrays some of that hunger, a grandiose systematization of gleaned hopes into an intended system of conceptualized hope still in the making. On hearing that reason cannot flower without hope, the positivist will object that reason ought to comprehend. Bloch, however, in a singularly positive way, appropriates to himself that which the positivist seems to have unmasked as wrongly posed questions. Like the positivist, he criticizes myths, religions, and philosophies as shadows, but he takes them seriously as foreshadowing that which is to be created. Utilizing a distinction made in the modern logic of science, he retains the norm which, as it were, has been skimmed off the facts. But instead of conceiving of it as an ontological substratum, he understands it as an aura of intentional experiences transcending the existent. He does not object to previous philosophers' courage to transcend, but to their false consciousness of it, to their mistaken belief that in transcending they get to know something that already has been there. This is how Aristotle understood essence as fuisse. Translator's note, Latin, fuisse, the past tense of esse, to be. Strenuous effort, to delineate the dimensions of utopia and to fix it inalienably for posterity. And in the same way, Heidegger still understands the absent presence of being as the expected return of something that already had existed in the beginning. Knowing, which from Plato's anamnesis down to Freud's analysis was understood as a return of memory, in fact, refers to something expected, something that objectively is only potential. This defines the contours of a vérité à faire, of a truth to be realized, which nowhere is real, yet, and to that extent, is utopian. It is true that since the days when Thomas More gave utopia its name, it has been able to unfold into a concrete utopia only to the extent that analysis of historical development and of its social motors has begun to unveil the conditions of its possible realization. Bloch does not deal with such analysis. He simply assumes it as accomplished through historical materialism. Yet he perceives a greater danger, namely that in his own camp the regulars with their treasury of quotations and the know-it-all practitioners would betray utopia for the business of its realization. To meet that danger, he calls for a more. What Bloch wants to preserve for socialism, which subsists on scorning tradition, is the tradition of the scorned, in contrast to the unhistorical procedure of Feuerbach's criticism of ideology, which deprived Hegel's sublate of half of its meaning, forgetting elevare and being satisfied with tollere. Translator's note, in fact, Hegel's sublate has three meanings in one: to raise, to preserve, to abolish. Bloch presses the ideologies to yield their ideas to him. He wants to save that which is true in false consciousness. All great culture that existed hitherto has been the foreshadowing of an achievement, inasmuch as images and thoughts can be projected from the age's summit into the far horizon of the future. Even the critique of religion, which Marx summarizes in his theses on Feuerbach, is given a new old interpretation. God is dead, but his locus has survived him. The place into which mankind has imagined God and the gods, after the decay of these hypotheses, remains a hollow space. The measurements in depth of this vacuum, indeed atheism finally understood, sketch out the blueprint of a future kingdom of freedom. Alluding to the amendment that Locke added to Leibniz, Bloch with tongue-in-cheek puts the economic determinism of official Soviet Marxism through the ringer to explain the cultural surplus, the codified truth in mythology. There is nothing in the superstructure that was not inherent in the foundation, except the superstructure itself. A Solomonic orthodoxy, here as everywhere, yet not a return from Marx to Hegel as some might assume. Unlike the phenomenology of the mind, the phenomenology of hope does not pursue its former incarnations. In Bloch's opinion, rather, the mind's figurations derive the objectivity of their appearance from the experimenting validation of the innovation projected originally. So far, philosophy has kept incognito her essence, the objective possibility of a kingdom of freedom. In the final count, Platonic anamnesis has always smothered the dialectically open eros, and all philosophy that existed hitherto, including Hegel's, has locked it up with contemplative antiquarian devices. Antiquarian because it dresses the future up as the long-ago past. Contemplative because of a double inversion whereby first the still-to-be-expected end is projected into the beginning, and then this act of genesis is subjected to theoretical discussion instead of being achieved through responsible praxis after critical preparation. Resistance to utopia, literary and psychological. The odds against a boom in utopia are high. Ever since, decades ago, Karl Mannheim pronounced the utopian impulse moribund, the sociology of knowledge has accumulated further confirming symptoms. The more long-range military planning, the more hermetically the Western world is closing itself off from the future. In West Germany, the aborted revolution from the right boasts posthumous literary triumphs over the revolution from the left. From Nietzsche it gains arguments against the wishful thinking of philosophical history. Hegel, whose strictures against mere opinions are well known, is seen as a promoter of progress, though only that progress in the consciousness of freedom that so easily is mere opinion. In the campaign against utopia, two strategic approaches are discernible. On the one hand, a sort of direct negation of history, the essence of that anthropological Platonism which decrees constant yardsticks for the optimum conditions of survival. It is supplemented by an aesthetic Platonism, which in a universe of pure forms promises eternity to the crystals formed by great individuals in felicitous moments. In both cases, the stream of history turns into a stagnant swamp. Instead of a meaning being realized, nature meaninglessly returns into itself. But world history wants to be understood in terms of epochs. It does not recognize any allegedly immutable nature, nor does the dialectics of progressive rationalization permit us to deny the possibility of a meaning in history. Another line of argumentation, therefore, tries not to negate history, but to overtake it. Eschatological thinking bets on the return of a mythological age, be it through pious evocation of destiny or through a botanizing philosophy of universal history. Philosophy of history has been outbid by metahistory, and a situation that has been defined by its place in history need no longer be subjected to a rational analysis of its objective possibilities. This thinking subjects history to the cycles of metahistory. It diverts the open historical process of possible self-determination back into the given proportions of natural events. The book of history is retranslated into the book of geological layers of world ages. The conservative theorem of the preservation and equilibrium of energy, which provides a common denominator for physics and ethics, excludes innovation and progress toward improvement. It even forbids dreaming about it. Bloch, however, describes even the most evanescent wish thoughts as elements of a great dream into the future, as the cell of a hope whose principle shall place humanity back on its hinges. Ernst Jünger, who may represent an entire school of thought, dismisses such speculations. Nowadays, even philosophers may be heard to say, if this or that did not exist, everything would be all right. Presumably, if this or that did not exist, things might be even more ghastly, not to mention the fact that one horror usually follows the other. Such ideas feed on the habit of identifying reason with morality. The world is full of reasonable men who denounce each other's unreason. Nevertheless, life goes on, though often in a direction different from what everybody intended. Bloch would recognize this as the language of doormen, who once more shut out the openness of the world, since it must be administered, must be a closed world. Against the new Romanticists, he could quote one of their respectable ancestors, Franz Baader. A fundamental prejudice of people is the belief that what they call the future world is a thing created and perfected for men, like a house built without their doing and ready for them to move in, whereas the real world is a building that man only can erect for himself, and that grows only with him. Nietzsche reinvented the old idea of eternal return in order to sanctify the moment. In the notion of amor fati, the will to power climbs the high mountain to the summit of high noon. This is the moment of full happiness for the disillusioned consciousness, because even in this most fragile moment of its restless striving, it is guaranteed return, and thereby eternity, meaningfulness, and an equal value with all other moments. The effort of this ultimate will negates its projection into the future and takes the present as it is. In the same spirit, Bloch says, the ultimate will is to be truly in the present. Man finally wants to be here and now as himself. Without delay and distance, he wants his full life. But his redeeming word, hope, excludes the notion of eternal return. The darkness of the lived moment can only become more impenetrable through a mere reform of moral consciousness, through a revaluation that only refortifies that which has been revalued. Therefore, the chain of eternal return must be broken. The exit into the virginal openness must be won in a utopian way. The urge not only presses itself into the openness where there still are alternatives of choosing, discerning, seeking a way. Besides that way, there is, in the objectively possible, something that agrees with us and that promises to satisfy the urge. Carpe diem can be realized only when the seal of amor fati has been broken. The cover of Platonic anamnesis has been taken off the dialectically open eros. This relationship to Nietzsche makes Bloch an antipode of the opponents of enlightenment, who, in their own way, try to use Nietzsche to take the wind out of utopia's sails. Disregarding for the moment such resistance, the reception of Bloch's work may also be handicapped by his mannerisms. The style of late Expressionism, made famous by Gottfried Benn in literature and by Carl Schmidt-Rottluff in painting, is now represented in philosophy by Bloch. It is the style of the first decades of our century, which in its middle now has become antiquarian, though with signs of maturation and relaxation. There are erratic blocks of hyphenated terminology, luxuriant growths of pleonastic turns, the heaving of dithyrambic breath, a choice of metaphors that is reminiscent of Arnold Böcklin, rather than of Walter Benjamin. All this still shows forcefulness and greatness, but it has become obsolete. Moreover, the utopian beam is broken into a spectrum of generational experiences that no longer are readily understood. The youth movement cannot be outmoded in the same respectable way as was Victorianism. We are a little tired today of breaking out into free nature, of nostalgia for a vagrant's life, of sentimentality for the circus and prostitution. There are traces of the Wandervogel's juvenile sociology even in the concept of hope. Present-day youth has been called skeptical for good reason, and the question arises whether all that Boy Scout romanticism did not reflect the experience of a past generation, whether new generational experiences may not clash, if not with utopia, then certainly with Bloch's initiation into utopia. The heritage of Jewish mysticism. Bloch unexpectedly emerged in the Bonn latitudes and has wrought havoc among the accustomed topography. Footnote: Bloch gave up his professorship in Leipzig, East Germany, and sought asylum in West Germany after the Hungarian Revolution. Wherever Marxism appropriates European philosophy without melting it in the heat of transcendent criticism, with Bloch's help it creates an amazing reconciliation of traditions that, especially in Germany, seem to have been separated along religious lines. The Jewish sensibility in Marxism brings to life certain perspectives that once were the province of Kabbalah and mysticism. Likewise, it unearths the Pythagoreic and Hermetic traditions that often were cut off and rarely were refined to the level of official philosophy. The Christian philosophy of the Middle Ages never succeeded in unraveling the Hellenistic knot. Under the label of Neoplatonism, this tradition re-entered the German consciousness during the Renaissance. Starting with Paracelsus and Jakob Böhme, handed down through the Swabian pietists to Hegel, Schelling, and Hölderlin, it crossed the threshold of high speculation with Schelling's philosophy of nature and his doctrine of the ages of the world. The very names of this philosophy of nature and of the ages of the world indicate how his thinking was orbiting elliptically around the two centers of matter and historical progress. Marx himself alluded to this apocryphal tradition of historical materialism, specifically quoting Jakob Böhme in connection with a polemic against the mechanical materialism in 17th century England and 18th century France. The passage, quoted by Adorno, can be found in Die Heilige Familie. Bloch ties this thread into a knot and makes its development his business. One must realize that in Germany, philosophy is so thoroughly imbued with the Protestant spirit that Catholics who wish to philosophize must almost turn Protestant, while on the other hand, Catholic thought has never emerged from the ivory tower of Thomism except in non-philosophical form. In this light, Bloch's philosophy, which incidentally interprets Christ very much in the spirit of the Old Testament as a prophet of a kingdom of this world, assumes interesting functions of mediating between traditional Protestant philosophies. Philosophy has been alienated from nature because its ears listened to the divine logos in history. Catholic thought has been alienated from history because its eye was turned exclusively to the appearance of the divine logos in nature. The tradition to which we have alluded, however, from its beginning embraces both ideas: the autonomous liberation of mankind through history and the restoration of fallen nature. In Marx's Paris manuscripts, Bloch found the formula for a rational retrieval of this utopia still enmeshed in myth. Socialism promises, along with the naturalizing of man, the humanizing of nature. Fully developed nature and definitively realized history lie together on the horizon of the future. Therefore, nature, which is never gone, and which always envelops us with so much brooding, indefiniteness, and cipher, remains the vision of tomorrow, not of yesterday. The overtones in this sentence of Bloch's point to the melody in Schelling's philosophy. Bloch's basic experience is darkness, the unresolved, the lived moment's nostalgia, that nothingness of the mystics which always craves thingness, the abstract reflection of which can still be seen in Hegel's logic. In this primeval hunger, the world not longs to be untied. If not untied, it will throw back, unsolved, life into its origins. Each lived moment, therefore, would, had it eyes, witness the beginning of the world which always recommences in it. Each moment is undeveloped, the year zero, the beginning of the world. This determination might have been gleaned from Schelling's first fragment of Ages of the World, where he studied time in its entirety. The same could be said of the subsequent sentence: nothingness as not yet traverses having become and beyond. Hunger becomes a productive power at the brittle front of an unfinished world. Therefore, the world as process is the gigantic proof of its saturated solution, that is to say, of the kingdom of its saturation. In Schelling's system of transcendental idealism, the unconscious assumes the double meaning of an impulsive subconscious out of the dark foundation of nature, and a winged superconsciousness out of the voluntary favor of a higher nature. Likewise, Bloch separates the nightly dream's unconsciousness from the daydreams, the no longer conscious of memory, from the not yet conscious of the future. Footnote: bewusst means both conscious and aware. In this view, the romantic pathos of an antiquarian approach misses an entire sphere of ciphers, symbols, mythical elements, which appear not only in legends, but in viewing nature and art, in dreams and visions, in poetry and philosophy. Bloch subjects these elements to a utopian treatment, trying to unravel their unredeemed nature and to interpret these emblems of the future. Into this anticipatory consciousness he even invites Carl Jung's archetypes and Ludwig Klages's diluvial images, though turned upside down. He finds in this consciousness the kingdom of freedom, where mankind is rid of self-alienation and directs its destiny in freedom. This can be achieved only by abolishing the domination of man over man, that is to say, in a socialist way. Only then one man's fortune need no longer be another man's misfortune. Only then the one need not be measured against the other. Matter as soul of the world. Technology without violence. However, any dream of a better life would be limited to an inner, nay quite enigmatic world enclave, were there not a potential that was to meet its anticipation, at least in history. Bloch skips the sociological historical inquiry into the objective possibilities derived dialectically from the social process. Instead, he goes back immediately to the general substratum of the world process, to matter, for real possibility is nothing but dialectical matter. This concept of potentiality, which already was subsumed in the Aristotelian conception of matter, had been enriched and fecundated in the subterranean streams of Neoplatonism until Schelling took it up again. Matter, or natura naturans, no longer needs the entelechies of form. It is the one and all. It creates and gives birth to the incarnations of its fertility. It is that which exists in potentiality, yet in such a way that the history of nature points to the history of mankind and depends on it. For mankind is charged with the ability to do or to do differently. In exchange with nature, this ability frees an ability to become, and an ability to become different. The subjective potential reacts to the objective potential, though it is not arbitrary but always mediated. First, through the objective tendencies of social development. Then through that which nature, though not completed yet, makes possible or makes impossible. That which is authentic in the world is still in expectancy. It is waiting, fearful of being frustrated, hopeful of success, to be realized through the labor of socialized men, literally through the work of their hands. Here is Schelling's doctrine of potentiality in a Marxist interpretation. Subjective potentiality coincides not only with what is coming into existence, but also with him who is realizing it in history. And these coincide the better, the more consciously men become creators of their history. Objective potentiality coincides not only with that which is changeable, but also with that which can be realized in history. And these coincide the better, the more the independent environment is also increasingly mediated with man. In utopistically postulating the harmony of the unreified object with the manifest subject, the harmony of the unreified subject with the manifest object, this new philosophy hopes to decipher the echo of an old identity. Bloch does not shrink from using the Kantian concept of judgment as broadened by Schelling's philosophy of nature. Along with the alienation of socialized man, nature is lost and demands to be confronted with the aborted outline of its concealed subject, to be interpreted as natura naturans, and to be led to its goal by the hand of man. The mechanical view, which leads to the technical management of the forces of nature, misses the concept of nature as needing to return to itself. Only when the teleological view comprehends the phenomena as extrapolations of themselves, as it were, the subjective purposes of human endeavor will no longer be suspended in empty air, but will find the connection with a purposefulness suggested by nature itself. Bloch takes up Goethe's quarrel with Newton and opposes to the science of nature a phenomenology of nature as a sympathetic configuration based on the profound heritage of Pythagorean number symbolism, Kabbalistic teachings on signatures, Hermetic physiognomies, alchemy, and astrology. But unfortunately, this Schellingian adumbration of a knowledge of beauty experienced in nature, of a knowledge of nature through art, but scantily conceals the embarrassing fact that there is no methodical direction for a phenomenology of nature. For all previous attempts were based on an inapplicable simile, the analogy of microcosm and macrocosm, of man and universe. To be sure, in these musings Bloch encounters the memorable problem of a technology without violence. Scientific theories and their technological application are indeed alien to nature. Both dispose of nature according to stated laws defining its behavior, for use. The functional relationships determined by these laws are indifferent to nature per se and productively ignorant of its essence. Technology, which has to proceed according to such laws, lacks the relatedness to any favors of nature, to the old natural world. Bloch criticizes this lack of relatedness to the earth, which is the source of the exaggerated artificiality of the bourgeoisie's mechanical universe, its specific misery and its specific ugliness. The overworked epithet bourgeoisie appears in this place because, Bloch feels, in the framework of capitalistic production relations, our technology has not only been developed but also been disfigured by them. Just as in the exchange of commodities the abstract relations of exchange values remain indifferent to the concrete use values, so in the natural sciences the abstract laws remain alien to the natural substratum. This analogy, touched upon by Lukács some decades ago in Geschichte und Klassenbewusstsein, encourages Bloch to expect a new development in the technological production forces under socialism. They will shed their abstract form and adapt themselves to a concrete cooperation with nature in production. The freedom won in social policies will be projected into natural policies. As Marxism has discovered the subject of history, the worker concretely creating himself in man as a worker, as Marxism expects the full discovery and realization of this subject under socialist conditions, so it is probable that Marxism will also, in its technology, penetrate into the subject of natural processes, not yet manifest per se, mediating men with the subject with men, itself with itself. According to Marx's original conception, the forces of production, including technology, remain the actual carriers of social wealth. When production relations that had become obsolete and narrow were revolutionized, these forces were merely liberated. It was even assumed that these production relations alone are responsible for the irrationality of an order that prevents objectively possible progress to reach a higher stage of development. Bloch, on the contrary, sees himself forced by certain experiences to question the production relation's innocence, which seems philosophically guaranteed. There are indications that in the East and in the West, in spite of their conflicts, social developments are tending towards a common denominator. Anyway, on both sides of the Iron Curtain, we observe an increasing number of phenomena lending themselves to the sociological interpretation of the industrial society. This aspect may have led some observers in the West to neglect, dangerously to neglect, the diverging trends that result from the different orders of property. But it seems to be true that the technological development per se produces an organizational framework that is less dependent on production relations than the Marxists had ever assumed. Moreover, the power of alienation produced by these institutions on the basis of technology is no smaller under socialism than under capitalism. Bloch preserves his utopia by prophesying a socialist resurrection not only for capitalism, but also for the technology it has produced. The capitalist nature of technological means and their organizational framework which exists in the socialist countries could then be explained as a sort of cultural lag. Extravagance of utopia and melancholy of fulfillment. This idea should not be confused with the effect that accompanies it. The latter appears in resentful cultural criticism, in social romanticism almost in spite of our knowing better. Bloch betrays it in his polemics against Walter Gropius and Le Corbusier, against the engineer's art of steel furniture and flat roofs and concrete architecture. The curse of abstract technology is said to communicate itself to the lines of architecture. They have an even more chilling effect as they allow no crannies but only kitsch lighting. In a general way, Bloch, like Lukács, opposes modern art not merely from a feeling of duty. In his praise of realism, he shows his affinity with classicist aesthetics. Like Hegel, he interprets art after the model of the symbol. The beautiful appearances reflect that appearance which things and forms project towards what they could be in the future, emerging matter instead of contoured ideas. This aesthetic can be seen as a complement of Adorno's. Art must not demonstrate its truth by referring to existing contradictions. The aesthetic problem takes us back to the political problem. Bloch is a citizen of a different republic. His thinking addresses itself to a different audience, for instance, when he tries to melt the dogmatism and empiricism of a frozen dialectic materialism under the sun of its utopian origins. His writing is beholden to different conventions. Thus, he fulfills his quota of jargon. He denounces Martin Heidegger's phenomenology as the experiences of a petty bourgeois animal. He scoffs at Claugus, the complete Tarzan philosopher. He dismisses D.H. Lawrence as a sentimental penis poet. The most obnoxious feature in all this is its lack of precision. Similar invectives against Jaspers may be explained as a defense against the fatuous phrase calling Bloch the Jaspers of the East. The comparison is self-destructive. There is not one tertium comparationis. But on the whole, Bloch's polemicisms use a coin in which many Western critics have paid him back. He feels no qualms about using, in his original version, the Stalin quotations which then were purged from the West German edition of his book, but which our local anti-communists did not fail to hold against him. But neither the political denunciation nor the complementary attempt to transform the Gnostic Bloch into a distant theologian should prevent us from looking for the dimension in which his philosophy takes its political root. Bloch merely dresses his intimate relationship to Lenin's strategy of violence in Gothic rags. Not without reason does Marxism include, besides the sort of tolerance that expresses itself in the kingdom of freedom, the cathedral-like vision that expresses itself in the kingdom of freedom, where freedom itself is conceived as a kingdom. Nor are the roads to that kingdom liberal. They are conquest of state power, discipline, authority, central planning, collectivization, orthodoxy. Total freedom precisely does not lose itself in hopscotch arbitrariness, which only leads to empty desperation. It can triumph only through its will to orthodoxy. These ideas are at one with deep traditions of German philosophy, and yet in the same breath that vision of kingdom, that essence of order are being sanctified in a manner which, with due respect, borders on the totalitarian. Order in all kinds of fields and spheres, from cleanliness and punctuality to the vista of all that is manly and masterly, from ritual to architectural style, from numerals to the philosophical system. The practical violence of the means transgresses the purpose, even in the muddiness of its theoretical anticipation. To be sure, Bloch knows very well about the melancholy of fulfillment. He speaks of a measure of non-arrival even in the advent, of the bitter dregs in that which can be realized. For the realizer's deed cannot be separated from the act of realizing. In realizing his cause, he can realize himself only step by step. The circle posed by the problem of educating the educators returns on the level of utopia. But even for this, a tempting solution is suggested in the formula of the increasing self-mediation of man and nature. A utopia that understands the dialectics of its own realization as utopian is not as concrete as it pretends it is. Perhaps the image of the kingdom of freedom owes its features, frozen in the vision of kingdom, to the exuberance of its original project. This exuberance, in turn, may be based on the sort of speculative materialism that exempts materialism from speculation. In discussing his famous thesis that you cannot realize philosophy without abolishing it, Marx argues against the young Hegelians' philosophy as follows. Their philosophy only considers its critical warfare against the world, but fails to recognize that all philosophy hitherto existing belongs to this world and is its supplement, even if only in the idea. Bloch concludes that the negation of philosophy refers to philosophy hitherto existing, and not to every possible and future philosophy. Marx, however, unmistakably meant to say the opposite, for he continues, the young Hegelians lack self-criticism, for they start out from the preconditions of philosophy and stop with its given results, even though, on the contrary, the latter, assuming their justification can be obtained only through the preconditions of the philosophy that existed hitherto, of philosophy as philosophy. Awareness of its autonomy belongs to the preconditions of philosophy. Philosophical reason must be able to give its own reason. A philosophy, however, that is critical of its own preconditions and has become critique itself is aware of being part of that which it criticizes. It is an expression of alienation, and its transcendence. Not before it abolishes itself and thereby realizes itself will philosophy be able to stand next to itself and make possible that knowledge which speculation always imagined it owned. Bloch's error here is more than one of interpretation. He crosses out the merely experimental validity of utopia, thus leaving unclarified the relationship of philosophical criticism to the sciences. The same is true of other representatives of dialectical materialism. If utopia wishes theoretically to understand the practical need for abolishing existing conflicts, then it will have to scientifically legitimatize its interest in knowledge in two ways, as a really objective need and as objectively capable of fulfillment. The hypothetical humility of utopian thinking is different from the awareness of being autonomous held by speculative thinking. The first feels that a philosophical concept can be disproved by science analyzing the conditions of its realization, but it does not expect its truth ever to be proved for good, for revolutionary praxis transcends even anticipatory theory. Speculative thought, on the other hand, believes that it can continue philosophy through research, that the latter can only prove, never disprove it. Bloch attempts a third alternative. He wants to retain speculation and to vary it in a utopian way. The guarantee of salvation is lost, but the anticipation of salvation retains its certainty. It must work out either this way or not at all. It can achieve all or nothing. Hope finally fulfilled according to the anticipated image of fulfillment, or chaos. If utopia draws the power of its consciousness from the experience that in history seemingly natural limits have proved to be transcendable, then it ought just as sternly to develop a consciousness of its own kingdom's limits. Certainly a dialectical analysis that functions not in merely approaching totalities but in anticipating them cannot meaningfully be lowered to the level of differential analysis. The utopia concept must not be demeaned into contents of regulative ideas. Just the same, it must keep aware of the possibility of such changes, which without warning might devour even utopia. In realizing itself, utopia could precipitate itself into a situation that categorically is concealed from utopian provision. New obstructions, new difficulties, new unbalances might appear, which, altogether truly different from all previous ones, might be so incompatible with the structure of problems conceivable at present that, even from the horizon of perfectly utopian awareness, they could not have been anticipated as problems. Utopia, realized, would be different. This awareness of a limit certainly does not suspend its consciousness, nor would it justify a renunciation of utopia by militants of the counter-enlightenment. The propaganda against the Jacobin results utopian beginnings may lead to, the hypocritical preachments against the terror of morality only increase the dangers to which they blind us. Bloch's materialism remains speculative. His dialectics of the Enlightenment transcends dialectics and reaches a doctrine of potentiality. Metaphorically speaking, and utopia always retains a measure of metaphor, Bloch's thought processes are derived from the development of a pregnancy of the world which is generally assumed rather than attempting to free us from the societal immobility of existing contradictions. Philosophy of nature here turns into the nature of his philosophy. The philosophers of a surviving European tradition, squeezed between Anglo-Saxon positivism and Soviet materialism, can only note the irritating fact that on the opposite banks of the Elbe River, a philosophy has been created which, having skipped Kant, as it were, and with a pre-critical approach, is just the same inspired by the great breath of German idealism. Thought is spreading its wings, as it must, even if the time of the augurs is gone.